So let's get right into it. Today, we're talking about history, but not just any history. We're digging into how the United States teaches its own past and why that whole conversation feels so critical right now. Because, the way we learn about where we came from completely shapes how we see the world today. So let me just ask you a question, straight up. Think back to history class. Did you ever learn about Juneteenth? The holiday that marks the real end of slavery? What about the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921, one of the single worst acts of racial violence in this country's history? For a whole lot of us, the answer is probably a hard no.
And look, that's not just a hunch. A recent poll found that 48%, that is nearly half of all Americans, weren't very aware of Juneteenth. That's huge. And it just goes to show you these massive gaps in our shared knowledge. And it's definitely not just about one holiday or one event. Okay, so here's the plan for our explainer. First, we're going to look at the symptoms, what we're calling America's history gaps. Then we'll get into the causes, how the past actually gets rewritten. After that, we'll break down 3 big mistakes we often make. First, ignoring the role of supremacy. Second, buying into the myth of a constant upward arc of progress. And third, failing to connect the dots between then and now. And finally, we'll wrap up with why all of this really matters. All right, let's jump into our first section. America's history gaps. You can think of these as the obvious symptoms you see when an education isn't telling the whole story.
So a great example is the story of George Washington. We all kind of learned this story, right? That he freed his slaves. It's a nice, clean narrative. Well, the real story is way more complicated. Yes, his will did promise freedom, but for most of the people he enslaved, it would only happen after his wife Martha died. So when Washington himself died, only one person was actually freed immediately. It's a perfect case of how we get a much simpler, cleaner version of history. And these gaps aren't just academic. They can be deeply personal. Just listen to this quote. It's from a man from Tulsa who only learned about the 1921 massacre, which happened in his own city, on the same streets where he went to school when he was an adult in college. Can you imagine that shock? Finding out that this incredible, vibrant community existed where you live, that it was destroyed in a horrific way, and that this entire history was just kept from you?
Okay, so why do these gaps even exist? That's what we're digging into next in Section 2, Rewriting the Past. Let's look at what's causing this distortion.
And this is not a new problem. This quote from a real textbook used in Georgia in the 1950s is just wow. It actually claimed that slave owners would have picnics for enslaved people, and then they'd have a great frolic. I mean, this is a conscious choice, right? To deliberately downplay the absolute horror of slavery and paint it as something almost charming.
And don't think for a second this is just ancient history. A current textbook in Texas says settlers brought slaves to help work the fields and do chores. Chores. Calling brutal, forced, violent slave labor chores. It just sanitizes the past so much that it loses all meaning.
So how does this happen on a bigger scale? Well, for starters, the U.S. has no national standard for teaching history. It's all up to the states, and their standards are all over the place. In fact, 7 states don't even mention slavery directly. Then you've got these politically motivated campaigns, like the one from the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which worked for decades to push a pro-Confederate version of history into schools. And that's all before you even get to some truly awful classroom ideas like slavery-themed Monopoly games. Yeah, that happened.
Okay, so this all leads us to the first of 3 big mistakes our source material argues we're making. Let's call it the first underlying condition, ignoring supremacy.
Here's the thing, and this is so important. A good history education means you have to be able to hold 2 seemingly opposite ideas in your head at the same time. The U.S. Constitution is a revolutionary document that built a democracy. And it is also a document that protected and was shaped by the institution of slavery, with things like the 3/5 Compromise. Both things can be true. It's about admitting that imperfect people created an imperfect, though still groundbreaking document.
And this quote just nails the danger of teaching a whitewashed history. A professor calls this feeling underground railroaditis, this tendency we all have to just assume, oh, of course I would have been on the right side of history. But as he puts it, if everybody was so willing to help, it wouldn't have needed to be a secret underground railroad in the first place. When you tell a simple story, it's way too easy for us to think, oh, I totally would have done the right thing.
All right, let's look at the second big mistake, the upward arc. This is this myth, this idea we're often taught that American history is just one long, steady, inevitable climb toward progress.
This timeline really shatters that whole idea of a smooth upward climb. So right after the Civil War, boom, Reconstruction starts. And by the 1870s, you had about 2,000 black men holding elected office across the South.
That is incredible progress. But then, the backlash. A brutal, violent backlash, like the Wilmington coup in 1898, where a multiracial, elected government was literally overthrown by white supremacists. So when we get to the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, a lot of what they were fighting for were rights that had already been won and then violently taken away. History isn't a straight line up. It's a story of progress, backlash, and constant struggle.
And it's not just Reconstruction, right? We do the same thing with the Civil Rights Movement. We all remember Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, but we often forget the event's full title, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The economic part was huge. In his later years, King was talking about a radical redistribution of economic power, a pretty core part of his message that almost always gets left out of the history books.
And that brings us to the final and maybe most important mistake, disconnecting the dots. This is our failure to draw a clear, straight line from the things that happened in the past to the world we see around us right now.
So there's this infamous interview with political strategist Lee Atwater, and he basically laid out the playbook for how racist appeals in politics evolved. He said back in the 50s you could be open about it. By the 60s you couldn't do that anymore, so you had to switch to abstract stuff like forced busing and states' rights. And by the 80s you talk about things that sounded purely economic, like cutting taxes, knowing full well that the result is that black communities get hurt the most. The language changed, but the target often stayed the same.
And if you want to see the direct result of not connecting those dots, here it is. This fact is just staggering. The gaps in wages and wealth between black and white Americans are actually wider today than they were back in the 1960s. Without understanding the history of redlining and housing discrimination and all those shifting political strategies, these kinds of inequalities seem to pop up out of nowhere. But they don't. You can draw a straight line from there to here. So that's the diagnosis. Which brings us to our final question. Why does any of this matter? What's the point of getting this right for our future? In an essay published right after he died, the great Congressman John Lewis left us with this. He said, "We have to study history, not just to know what happened, but because, in his words, the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time. History isn't just a subject in a book. It's a living, breathing toolkit for fixing today's problems." And that really brings us to the heart of the matter. Ignoring or just downplaying the role of white supremacy in the American story isn't a neutral act. It's an active choice. And as the source material argues, a history of America that leaves that out is, in itself, a white supremacist history of America.
So I want to leave you with this idea. History isn't over. It's not something that's just locked away in the past. We're all writing the next chapter right now, every single day. So the real question is, what story are we going to tell next?